Good morning, and welcome to our Charging Ahead webinar this morning. Today we'll be covering Bridging the Skills Gap, Workforces for Electrification. We'll cover off a couple housekeeping items and also allow people to join. So my name is Ezra Beeman. I'm Managing Director. And I have with me Sarah Gonzalez, who will be helping manage the Q&A as well as the voting. Um, and we'll be running through the topics listed here in terms of the impact assessment and the solution development case study. And then we'll finish with key takeaways and recommendations, as well as the next Charging Ahead webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and so it will be sent in the follow-up email along with a copy of the slide and a short briefing, a written briefing or blog, so that you can review at your own time or you can forward on. The other point I'd make is that you're welcome to put in any questions along the way. We'll hold them till the end, and then Sarah will manage their sending to me, and I'll do my best to answer. And also, please don't forget to vote on the topic when that is available. We are very keen on what people think is most useful to cover initially, and we will be taking that into consideration as we develop our forward program. Actually, Sarah has just published it, so I'm pleased you can start voting now. And otherwise, let's get started. All right, I've introduced myself. Okay, let's talk about some of the key drivers of all of this potential change. Um, Here we have the previous U.S. emissions trajectory and where we had expected to be by 2030 under the previous Paris Agreement targets. Those are currently being unwound, so the federal targets are not going to be in force, at least under the current administration. However, if you look at the state-based targets, and we've only taken a selection of them, they still are relatively ambitious, seeing us achieve a zero carbon emissions outcome as early as 2045 in the case of Maryland and California, and 2050 in the case of the other states. Now, the challenge ahead varies by state, and you can see on the bottom left graphic that different states have different sources of their emissions, with industrial emissions being a very varying quite significantly, as well as power emissions and even residential building emissions. And so it really will be a state by state case for what sort of changes will be needed to achieve this level of decarbonization. Now, while we're all focused on the different pathways for achieving decarbonization, what is often not well understood or left to last or not yet addressed is the necessary skills and capacity that our workforce is going to need to be able to enable this change, but also to ensure that this change is done in a timely and fair or equitable basis. So the work that we're about to cover is some of the work that we have been involved in across the range of planning for and developing up responses over the last year or two. In terms of what we'll be covering today, and this is really a range of policy planning that is being widely done across the country and in other countries. Things like planning for building electrification or transport electrification, decarbonizing of the gas sector entirely, which may include gas system decommissioning. Um, we also need to decarbonize the transport sector as well as the power sector. Now, the items here that are in gray are not covered in this material. And that's just because we haven't been involved in workforce development activities in these two particular areas, but they are needed just as much as in any of the other areas that we have been involved in. And I'd say overall, I think workforce is, we are seeing some glimmers of activity in that space, but it is really fundamental to success. And so we would hope to see more focus on workforce development before we get into a really crunchy time, because we think that it has the power to stop a lot of this transition in its tracks. You don't have the capabilities, and also the change may not be fair or may come too quickly. All right, let's talk about some of the examples that we can draw from in around building electrification, gas sector decarbonization, a transition of utility to 100% renewables, and a gas system decommissioning project we were involved in. So in this first case, which was a state uh, government was looking at different pathways for electrifying buildings, both residential and commercial. And so we were engaged to analyze what the impact would be on the number of FTEs. And so you can see here, we first started by estimating the number of FTEs over time under no change. And you can see we were modeling gas fitters, AC technicians, and electricians. This was really a trades focused analysis, and did not sort of cover any utility impacts. You can see that we've just given two examples here. If there's a policy change for no new gas in new premises, which is a not uncommon policy setting, it fundamentally changes trajectories, particularly of the HVAC in this particular jurisdiction. And of course, that change in the rate of need for FTEs requires that these be created, and it's not like the population is going to shift. So the training system, the incentives and education of the workforce needs to anticipate and lean into this in order to support this sort of a policy. And to do it from a standing start is probably not feasible. So this situation and issue and risk is even more pronounced if you were to say ban no new appliance sales in next year. So if next year was 2024, you can see all of a sudden a jump in the need for electricians and a fall in the need for gas related field technicians. So these are just two examples where through this analysis you can identify what the change needs to be. And in this case, we were able to advise, hey, don't do this immediately. It will have a lot of challenges. Maybe give the industry 5 years so that the training and the other support structures can be put in place to enable this transition to happen, and to consider the impacts of the workforce and the ability of the workforce to respond. So turning to another example, here we were looking at a gas sector decarbonization. This was on a state basis. There were 7 scenarios, business as usual, looking at clean fuels, looking at dual fuels, looking at energy efficiency led strategy, looking at the use of cold climate heat pumps, because this was a cold climate, and then an electrification scenario, and then a thermal energy or heat based scenario. And they have different rates of gas consumption decline depending on the scenario. Now, we then looked at the different number of jobs in this particular state, which you can get from NAICS data. And we also looked at the level of effort. So we used two different methodology depending on if we're looking at the impact on the utility, or we were looking at the impact on the trades for appliance installation, for example. Um, and for the trades in the field, we looked at installation effort. In the case of the utilities, we looked at how many jobs currently exist and how much is being spent. And then when you model the change in capital expenditure, but as also operational expenditure, that was used to then pro rata adjust the numbers. And just going to the next example, there's what this looked like. You could see here from a current 100%, there was a change in forecast change in gas utility jobs, as well as gas trade jobs, and then the change in utility jobs. So because of the timelines here, there's not a lot of change until about 10 years out. So that gives time to develop the workforce in a way that's needed. But fundamentally, some of the gas workforce will need to transition into the electricity workforce. But over 10 years, there'll be a lot of attrition, a lot of opportunity for retraining. But this needs to be put in place to enable these sorts of changes. Now let's turn to a utility that was aiming for 100% renewables um, uh, by a certain time frame. I think it was 10 years. And in this case, uh, the work that we did focused on translating these capital programs. I mean, there was already a plan to transition out or transition into 100% renewables at the wholesale level. There was plans for behind the meter resources to enable it, and that together would lead to a change in forecast capex and opex. Um, we also um, then translated that into an estimate of FTEs. Um, this project didn't get all the way through to detailed planning of the transition and the workforce, but what it did identify was that this organization needed to put more effort into understanding what was the future skills mix it needed in much more detail and to work that through. The other thing they needed to understand and to develop was strategies on how they were going to increase the capacity and capability of their organization with this new skills mix. And then finally, as the mix of skills and the availability of these skills in the market means that you have to revisit what the appropriate and most optimal mix of make versus buy. All right, let's change. So this one we are able to tell you which what the organization was because this has been published. Not all the other ones will be or might be published. So in this case, we're working with the Australian Capital Territory or ACT government to help them understand different impacts and implications and costs and benefits of different gas system decommissioning strategies. And so the three things, and you can see this on a gas system decommissioning webinar that we presented, but the focus on in that webinar was not on the workforce impacts. So we wanted to bring this here because other states are looking at gas system decommissioning, California as an example, and so we think it's very topical and relevant to look at how different assumptions around the timing of the decommissioning, whether how far out in the future, whether it might be triggered by a falling below a certain threshold of demand, and then how those costs might be allocated because as you allocate costs, prices rise on smaller volumes, and that can lead to a death spiral where all of a sudden people disconnect just because it's so expensive, and that can be very sudden. Our modeling showed us. So here you can see two different approaches, whether it's phased or a shutdown threshold. They have different timings, but you can also see different rates of change. And of course, that's got very different impacts for how the workforce needs to be transitioned or can possibly be transitioned. So anybody looking at system decommissioning, this is definitely something that needs to be looked at very diligently because of the feedback loop of pricing and folks disconnecting quickly or other methodologies, it may not actually be practical or feasible or politically acceptable. So workforce really needs to be factored into any of this sort of analysis. All right, now let's look at okay, we looked at a couple of different examples where the scope and degree of the workforce changes required or needed were starting to be better understood. But going from that point to coming up with a workforce development solution, it's about half the job. And so this works through what we think is a best practice approach to developing up what are the feasible options, um, what is it going to cost, and then building up a forecast of this workforce development over time to meet an identified need. So one of the first places to start is what is the underlying dynamics of the workforce? How many retirements are there? How many transfers in and out of the sector are there? And what are the level of expected new entries under business as usual? So here's an example of what that looks like. You can pull this together in a model to understand what your supply of resources is over time, and also with the transfers and retirements and new entries, how different programs are going to affect those things differently. For example, there might be incentives to have retirements become deferred or people to stay longer. There might be methods for retraining so the transfers go up. And then of course, there are incentives targeted at folks just entering the workforce at the beginning of their careers. So the next step were to look at the kinds of barriers to getting more people into jobs and occupations where they're needed. And in this particular project, we conducted interviews. We also did desktop research, and we identified um, the following key barriers. So the competitiveness of wages. You have to be competitive to attract folks. There was reported stigma in moving into a blue collar job. There might be a problem about belief in the incentive stability. And this actually came across both in research and interviews, that if there's a big incentive like the IRA, that people need to believe it's going to be there for the long term to make a career change. There might be a declining interest in the energy sector. There might be a shrinking pool of workers because of a decline in birth rates. The ability to access training. And one of the things we learned was just how much training was done on the job rather through a certificate course or any kind of formal training, with the exception of license holders. But for most of the folks doing the work, they didn't hold a license that was done at the company level. Any sort of entry requirements and the cost of the transition to the alternative trade. These are all key barriers that we identified via our research or interviews. So, in terms of one of those elements, which is probably the most important one, is looking at how what wages people can earn in comparable occupations. You can see here generally that the wages for trades are among the highest of the blue collar trades, with the exception of construction. So something to be mindful of is just how well some of these other alternatives are paying, and to make sure that the wages in the area, they'll have to rise to the level needed to encourage the amount of entry required. So, moving on to best practice development, we also did research here across a number of areas. Whether it's the narrowing pool, the declining interest. So these are some of the barriers. Here's some of the solutions we found. I won't go into the detail here. I think the key takeaway is there are lots of examples of workforce development out there, but trying to understand their effectiveness in terms of how much change they enabled in terms of new FTEs into the industry, that is sorely lacking. As is how much was funded. Sometimes you can see some funding here, but bringing those two things together about how well each strategy delivered in terms of dollar per new worker, that was much more difficult to find. And probably more work is required to make that information more widely available so that good decisions can be made about where to put money, because there is a substantial workforce development need. And one of the key recommendations we have at the end is that we're not seeing the budgets being brought to bear on this particular challenge, which is something that policymakers in particular, I think, need to pay more attention to if we're not going to run into a workforce um, issue as we start to really ramp up this transition. Okay, so in this particular example, we landed on four key strategy. One was a new entry signing bonus, and that was based on a particular cost that we got from research. We have a retraining bonus, and we also did career promotion to promote the career to others. Make it more widely understood, and also for a focus on underrepresented groups within the job sector. So, bringing that all together, we also added in some other, which we didn't put a cost in there. But if you want to increase labor supply, you might also do things like streamlining process and paperwork, because that takes up time. Usually takes up senior people's time, issuing things like instant permits. But the rest of this put a number on how many FTEs we thought could be elicited through these different programs, whether it's the new entry, promoting the career, i.e., education and marketing, as well as the retraining bonus. And we were able to, and so first of all, we looked at the underlying estimated need, but then we smoothed it. And in fairness, probably the amount of new entry would ramp up. It takes time. But you can see here in terms of the workforce need, and then the ability through these programs to generate that additional workforce over time. Um, uh, lined up the estimated demand versus estimated supply. So this is a particular case study. At the state and larger level, it's probably a very comparable challenge, and likewise, without funding, without programs, it's unlikely to happen on its own. All right. So key takeaways and recommendations, and we should have some time for questions. So key takeaways: achieving these targets, including at the utility level, will require significant workforce development. I hope that's one thing that's come through clearly with all those different trajectories and timings, et cetera. Um, the impacts vary quite significantly depending on what pathways are being pursued. Um, Best practices really, as part of the planning process, an assessment of the workforce impacts and developing up strategies for enabling them has got to be really part of every story. With analysis, we've seen and we've shown that, at least in plan form, the transition can be effectively managed. That all of those that appear to be possibly needing a new job with the amount of time can be retrained into these new equally high-paying jobs, but that requires establishment of these programs. Um, and to do that, we need funding. And to see more funding in this area is currently a gap as far as we understand. So recommendations, so ensure that transition policy planning includes workforce impact and optimization assessments, et cetera. It's important that the workforce is engaged with early so that they can be brought along the journey, that they see that there is a future and an attractive future in the transition, and they can be part of it, or risk significant political pushback. Um, Understanding the timing and mix of the impacts and developing consistent strategy is essential for an equitable and timely transition. And finally, significant education and support is needed across a wide range of sectors and job classifications. And it's important that the programs and fundings are commensurate to achieving that. Well, thank you for your attendance. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to do my best to try and answer them. Um, okay, so here we go. Why would HVAC full-time employees decrease with heat pump demand increasing? I don't think that they should be decreasing unless the job categorization in that particular jurisdiction meant that they also were doing some gas related work. It might be the heating part of it, and so if they have a combination of heating and then um, uh, and it doesn't take as much labor. But generally, I agree that with heat pumps, especially reverse cycle heat pumps, there's going to be a lot of activity, and you just will be doing work on electrical rather than the gas side of it. What should policymakers focus on in the near term? Well, I'm hoping that this webinar causes any of policymakers to just think about and question. We've done all this work. Did we forget the workforce piece? And if so, to then start moving to make sure that this part of it is also taken care of. Like, a lot of work's been done across each of the sectors: gas, transport, electricity, and there's a lot of things to work through around adding new load to the electricity system, and what is the best decarbonization strategy for gas. But you cannot finish that strategy and policy development until you have a strategy for workforce. And so that's what we need to focus on. Make sure that that is assessed and addressed as soon as possible, particularly for any jurisdiction that is looking to lead in this area. What has been the most challenging part of this type of analysis? I would say just the lack of um, publicly available information about programs done to date. I mean, workforce development happens all the time, and in the energy, electricity utility industry, we've had brain drain, we've had demographic changes that required systematic planning. So it has been done before, but I don't know that it's ever been done with the urgency and cross economic, cross sector impacts that we're seeing now. So just getting access to the information, the direct primary research with interviews was really helpful and useful. But yeah, we could see more data and sharing of best practices, I think. What do you see as the most promising opportunities for youth, early career professionals, and folks transitioning their careers to gain electrification or infrastructure decarbonization skills? Well, I mean, when I look at what the programs I've been involved in, seem really attractive. I mean, utilities are making real efforts to lower barriers to be able to walk into these jobs. You get on the job training, you get paid to be trained in these areas. Um, and so it really I think it's not necessarily that you're going to get paid well or that it's interesting work. I think a lot of it is around the education. So I think, if you like working outdoors, that's one kind of a job. If you like working behind a desk, that's a different kind of a job. But really, I would say engage with your local utility around opportunities and cadet intake. And equally, there's people in your neighborhoods all the time doing these installations, and to have a and to speak with these field folks about what opportunities might be available. I know that a lot of the people that we talked with that had their own, that ran these operations. They're one of their primary sources of recruitment is just being out there in the field. Do you think the existing workforce plans or future roadmap development would be significantly impacted by the current admin? I mean, I think that the previous set of plans is going to be impacted, at least what I've seen around proposed changes to IRA. I mean, a lot of that funding has been locked in or dispersed, so that should continue. And I'm sure this will go through the courts. But there's definitely a different focus on what needs to be done. And so, yeah, I think the current administration has got to have an impact. That impact is limited, though, right? And so states have a lot of influence in this sector, and so I think the states are still probably the primary drivers of a lot of this, with the exception of course, the federal national grid transmission. Do you think we could hit 2030 or 2035? Well, 2030 is getting awful close. I mean, when we looked at this for utilities, it's still possible. You need to be looking at clean fuels into existing power stations. You need to be looking at renewable and battery solutions. But we're seeing in places like Australia, you can operate on zero load and 100% renewables in places like South Australia, which have been doing it for years. Not all the time, but at peak times. So it is possible. I think it's a lot harder than any of the early adopters have probably thought. But again, it really depends how close the organization is, and what level of will there is at the top. But if you don't bring along the workforce, I think it's much less likely to be successful. All right. Well, noting we are at time, I want to thank everybody for your attendance. I want to request that before you leave, that you do vote, and send anyone you think might be interested in this the links that we will send you, and hopefully we will look forward to welcoming you in July to the state of the art in virtual power plants webinar, which we think will be very interesting. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you.